who are you? Who is the one that hates or loves that self? What is going on here? The dog does not have that problem, because the dog has not arrived yet at ego. The dog has no self-image. The dog does not live, or your cat. I saw your wonderful video about the death of your cat, just very profound and beautiful, by the way.
Thank you.
Your cat the animal does not yet have an ego, so the dog is itself. The dog has no problem with body image or self-esteem, because the dog is, and this is why most animals are more joyous than, less problematic than humans. They do not carry the weight of the self, what the Buddha called the self. And the Buddha, one of the main teachings of the Buddha is to recognize the unreality of the self, that it is a mental construct that you mistake for who you are. So ultimately, even if you identify with a possession which seems to be out there, the only way you can experience a possession is as a thought form in your mind. Now the ego, which is a mind-made sense of self, a mind-made identity that consists of narratives, thoughts that you identify with. It's the earliest story about the rising of the ego is the myth of Narcissus. This is, of course, where the word narcissism comes from, and every ego is a kind of has very strong narcissistic elements to it. The story of Narcissus is there was a young man, very beautiful, in ancient Greece, and this young man, because that was a time before mirrors were invented, and before we had the wonderful invention of selfies, he had never seen himself. And one day he looked into a pool of water and he saw his own reflection. And he was so fascinated by his own reflection. The story says that he fell in love with himself, but my interpretation is really that he became obsessed with himself, but not with himself, with the image of himself. And after that, he was no longer a happy person. There are various versions of that story, but his life didn't go well after that. So that, I believe, there's sometimes very deep wisdom embodied in mythology, in myth. It really, what it points to is the arising of the human ego, which is a kind of phantom self that you carry around, that you mistake for who you actually are. It consists of identifications with possessions, identification with your own body, including, of course, the color of your skin. It's part of your own body. Identification with things that you can do, abilities, things you know. Identification with all kinds of things. Now, what does it mean, identification with? It means you derive your sense of self from something that is not you. So let's say it's my car. And it could start for a little child who gets a toy car. And so the child is given a toy car, and that's the beginning of the ego, is the feeling of the child, this is mine. So there's a certain identification with the toy, a self-identification. So it enhances, because it only works if another child does not have that toy, then it really works. This is my car. So it enhances a certain sense of identity. And identity is something that humans desperately seek after meeting the needs of shelter and food and shelter. One could almost say the next thing after that is the psychological need in human beings for a sense of identity. They need to that, and the first thing that humans do, and you cannot, there's no preventing this. They seek an identity by identifying with this, that, or the other. Later, the adult may have a car and derives part of their sense of identity from having this car, but it only works because it's compared. The ego is comparative, the image in your mind of who you are. It only works because other people don't have it. So imagine you have a Rolls Royce. I assume you don't, but imagine you have a Rolls Royce and it enhances your sense of self. Every time you look at it, you sit in it, you are seen by other people. It enhances your identity, your sense of self. Now imagine a scenario where, let's say there's a kind of a twilight zone. Suddenly you wake up in a reality where every human being at the age of 20 is given the same Rolls Royce. Everybody drives exactly the same Rolls Royce. Suddenly it would no longer serve to enhance your identity because you have nothing to compare itself to, because the ego needs, ultimately it seeks some kind of superiority. It compares itself to others in one way or another. It seeks some kind of superiority over others. It's an unconscious process. It wants to emphasize what I call your form identity. This is me. And this is a normal process. There's no point in wanting to stop it from happening. A child needs to go that way until finally an egoic sense of self is formed. And when we talk about identification, what are we really talking about? Let's say you identify with a possession or with an achievement, or you identify with the way you look, and that could give you a happy identity because you look better than most. This is for you. That's probably the case. For me, that was not the case. I did not look great. So when my ego was developing, it could not enhance its identity by focusing on that, because my body didn't look great, and my ego was looking for other ways to identify with. But I assume in your case, for example, your ego, when it grew, to some extent identified with the way you look, because the ego always seeks the most obvious thing. And I would have been very happy to be as handsome as you when I was young, but it was not the case. I had to find something else to identify with. And I finally found intellectual knowledge. I thought of myself, I started reading books, and I thought, I'm actually more intelligent than most people. So an image formed in my mind that this is me, and there's always an unease behind it, because the ego is never feels really at ease or fulfilled. There's always an underlying sense of lack, of insufficiency, of not enough. I am not enough. Because ultimately it's only a mental image that you mistake for who you are. It's often associated with a narrative in your mind that tells you about my life. You call it my life. Me and my life. This is me. This is my life. People have a relationship with themselves. Isn't that strange? They have a relationship with them. So this is why you have to... I hate myself. I love myself. In both cases, it's better to love yourself than to hate yourself. But in both cases, there's a duality, there's a split that has happened. There's you, and there's a self that you either hate or love.